Now to a story we have been following. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is defending the Biden administration's handling of the migrant crisis at the southern border. There are currently more than 13,000 unaccompanied minors in U.S. custody. Under the Trump administration, all migrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border during the pandemic were turned away. But the Biden administration changed that policy to allow in children while still turning away families and individual adults. Now the administration is scrambling to house them as more continue to cross the border. For more, I'm joined by Nicole Sganga. Nicole is a CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter. Nicole, good to see you again. So Republicans say that the Biden administration's new policies on unaccompanied minors at the border have caused this current crisis. How did DHS Secretary Mayorkas respond to this criticism and defend the president's policies?
Well, we saw Secretary Mayorkas today defend the Biden administration for more than 4 hours, 4 hours and 2 minutes to be exact, deflecting rounds and rounds of questioning from GOP lawmakers and some Democratic lawmakers that had some really tough questions about some of the statistics you just cited there, Elaine, including the 13,000 children that are in U.S. Custody and 4,200 right now that are stuck in Custom and Border Protection custody and housing that is unfit. Now, Secretary Mayorkas, citing a broken immigration system that has preceded the Biden administration before his time, pointing to an influx of migrants on the border that has been ticking up since last year. He did concede in a statement on Tuesday and again repeated today that the U.S. is on track to encounter more migrants at the southwest border than we have in over 20 years. That's a big statement. And as you pointed out, Secretary Mayorkas also explained why we're seeing so many of these unaccompanied minors at the U.S.-Mexico border, that the Biden administration is using a public health measure known as Title 42 that was invoked by the Trump administration to expel single adults and some family members back into Mexico that are seeking asylum, but that it is not using that specific order on children. It is allowing children to enter into the United States and to process their asylum claims and go through the court system here. And so certainly Secretary Mayorkas also trying to appeal to some of these lawmakers who are mothers and fathers, noting that he has seen infants at the U.S.-Mexico border during his last visit into Texas, that he has encountered 5-year-olds, that he met 3 siblings who actually came to the United States and lost their mother during that treacherous journey.
Well, Nicole, it's interesting because Secretary Mayorkas also avoided calling the situation at the border a crisis. How did he characterize it instead?
That's right. He sort of used every word but. He called it undoubtedly difficult. He called it a really large challenge. And as I said, it was a 4-hour hearing, and there was question after question about why he was unwilling to call this a crisis. Some lawmakers even pointing out that DHS has directed FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to assist at the U.S.-Mexico border. And would Secretary Mayorkas refer to it as an emergency if he was not willing to refer to it as a crisis? But the secretary didn't relent. He said he's not spending any time on the language that we use. At one point, he said, if we want to speak about language, I'll share with you how I define a crisis. He went on to say, quote, a crisis is when a nation is willing to rip a 9-year-old child out of the hands of his or her parent and separate that family to deter migration. Of course, there, a reference to the zero tolerance policy of the Trump administration back in the summer of 2018 that did separate hundreds of migrant children from their parents. That mission to reunite some of those children with their parents still underway today.
Well, unaccompanied minors are supposed to be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services within 72 hours of being picked up by border officials. But CBS News has learned that more than 3,000 were being held beyond that time frame. Did Secretary Mayorkas say how he plans to address that situation?
Yeah, two things, Elaine. The first is that the Secretary has deployed FEMA, as we noted, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to the border to try to facilitate this transfer of children from CBP custody after 72 hours and into the hands of HHS, the Health and Human Services Administration, which is responsible for the children there on out. And so right now, DHS is actively searching for places that they can put these children, suitable shelters. Right now, a camp for oil workers in Texas has been converted into emergency housing. A Dallas Convention Center is also set to start sheltering teenage boys beginning this week. Federal installations overseen by the U.S. military and one out in California overseen by NASA are being considered as possible facilities to house youth. Some lawmakers expressed concern to the Secretary that there were facilities in their districts that were being considered, that they were being left out of the loop of some of this decision-making. The Secretary committed to them that he would work with them and local law enforcement, local authorities to sort of move that process forward.
Well, Secretary Mayorkas also discussed FEMA's participation in coronavirus vaccination efforts, particularly among marginalized and minority communities. Nicole, how is the agency working to reach those groups?
Yeah, well, this is a really popular question, Elaine, because we are seeing across the country those that are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, including Black and brown communities, have not been getting vaccinated, at the rate we're seeing among some other Americans. So, for example, in Florida, African Americans account for only 6% of vaccinations, despite making up 14% of cases and 16% of deaths. So what FEMA has done is that it has tried to set up pilot community vaccination centers in some of these communities, and it uses data from the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index and also U.S. Census data to determine where it is setting up these locations. And so even though it is supporting over 900 state and local vaccination centers, it's also setting up these sort of federally run vaccination centers in places like Philadelphia, Miami, Oakland, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And actually, yesterday, the FEMA administrator who is spearheading this project, Administrator Bob Fenton, testified before Congress. He spoke about how they recently opened a center in Chicago. They opened this center statewide, and that they had to sort of regroup after they discovered that they had allocated 87% of the 40,000 appointments at this vaccination center to white individuals. And so, they ended up just accepting vaccination appointments for individuals who are living in Chicago who are part of these vulnerable zip codes. And that is happening from coast to coast in all 50 states right now.
Finally, Nicole, Secretary Mayorkas said domestic violent extremism is the greatest and most persistent threat to the country. U.S. intelligence agencies also released a report on domestic terrorism Wednesday. What did it say about what's contributing to this elevated threat?
Yeah, well, this report, a very strong report, predicted that social and political factors will almost certainly, that was the words of the report, almost certainly spur domestic violent extremists to engage in further violence in 2021, kind of a grim forecast. And it pointed to a few factors, the coronavirus pandemic being one of them, what it called emboldening impact of the violent breach at the U.S. Capitol. So after January 6th, how that has been used as sort of a recruiting tool and has emboldened some of these domestic violent extremists. Also narratives of fraud in the recent general election and conspiracy theories that promote violence. Also, this report looking at a variety of social media platforms, including targeted websites and encrypted apps that are used to recruit individuals into these domestic violent extremist groups and also used to disseminate information and plans. One thing we should point out, Elaine, as well, is that this report found that racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists were the most likely to conduct mass casualty attacks against civilians.
Really disturbing to hear. Nicole Sganga for us. Nicole, thank you.
Thank you.